U.S. Naval War College is the Navy's home of thought. Established in 1884, NWC has become the center of naval sea power, both strategically and intellectually. The following Issues in National Security lecture is specifically designed to offer scholarly lectures to all participants. We hope you enjoy this upcoming discussion and future lectures.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our 7th Issues in National Security lecture for this academic year. I'm Captain Dunn Ricino. It's my pleasure to be your host for today's event. I'd like to note that we are gathered here in person, and we also have a large audience dialed in on Zoom. Over the 2024 through 2025 academic year, we have been offering lectures from some of the best scholars in the world, from within our resident faculty. This effort is intended to share a portion of the Naval War College's academic experience with the spouses and significant others of our student body. We also welcome participation by the entire Naval War College extended family, including members of the Naval War College Foundation, international sponsors, civilian employees, colleagues throughout Naval Station Newport, and others around the globe. While the primary purpose is to share information and learn together, we do offer documentation in the form of certificates of completion to all participants who attend at least 70% of the offered lectures. You can participate here in the audience, via Zoom, or even by watching the lectures when they are posted on YouTube. We ask you to keep track of how and when you participate, and we will ask you to self-certify towards the end of the series. Let's look briefly at our upcoming schedule. Next week, on 29 April, we will host Professor Olenda Johnson, who will lecture on warfighters and strategic empathy. This will happen here in the Spruance Auditorium at the normal time. On 13 May, Vietnam prisoner of war, our Professor Porter Halliburton will offer his dynamic presentation on his experiences as a POW for nearly 8 years. This lecture will take place from 10:30 to 1200 here in the Spruance Auditorium, and a special Zoom login will be announced for this event. On 27 May, we will close out the series with Professor John Moore's entertaining and enlightening lecture, Churchill and America, which will return to our normal time of 16:30. And now for the main event. At the conclusion of the presentation that follows, we will welcome questions from our in-person audience. Please use the microphones located at each seat so that all of us, including our virtual participants, can hear the question. As Russian forces floundered in the early part of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, reports emerged of forces from a Russian private military company arriving on the front lines to bolster the Russian army. It wouldn't be long before the Wagner Group would become front-page news. While this shadowy outfit gained international notoriety through its participation in Ukraine, the Wagner Group had long served as Moscow's mercenaries abroad, particularly across the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. This lecture surveys the rise and fall of the Wagner Group from conception to decapitation and considers what's next for Russia's use of mercenaries. Professor Christopher Faulkner is an assistant professor of national security affairs in the College of Distance Education here at the Naval War College, where he teaches courses on international security and foreign policy analysis. He first joined the Naval War College in 2021 as a postdoctoral fellow and holds a PhD in security studies from the University of Central Florida. His research focuses on militant recruitment, civil-military relations, and private military companies. His book, tentatively titled Orchestra of Death, The Rise and Fall of the Wagner Group, is forthcoming from Columbia University Press. Please join me in welcoming Professor Faulkner.
All right, good afternoon. It's nice to see a pretty big audience here, so whether you're here by obligation or out of interest, thanks for being here, and I'm excited to give this talk. Don mentioned the tentative title of my book. I think the publisher is rejecting that title, so in the Q&A, if you have feedback for what a good book title would be, I'd be open to that. So as the title suggests, I'll be talking a little bit about Russian mercenaries, but Mostly I'm going to talk about the area that I'm most familiar with, or the organization I'm most familiar with, the Wagner Group. And whether or not you're familiar with it, I think this audience might be a little more familiar than most. It made front page news for its engagement in Ukraine, for its involvement in Syria, across Africa and the Middle East. I just want to jog your memory briefly to kind of illustrate one of its more notorious engagements in Bakhmut in Ukraine throughout the summer, winter, and 2022 and spring of 2023. So this is just an aerial photo, and if you're interested in seeing more about kind of the destruction and what was a Pyrrhic victory for the Wagner Group, this is a good illustration of a place where it became completely decimated, what most have called a battle of attrition, where we saw Wagner engage in recruitment. We saw Wagner engage in shock troops where they drew enemy fire, basically with nothing more than a rifle or a grenade to try to draw out Ukrainian positions, and hemorrhage personnel to the tune where their mercenary leader suggested that they lost upwards of 20,000 troops. Estimates vary widely, but ultimately what we saw were conscript prisoners basically sent into what became titled a meat grinder kind of conflict. The one you may be more familiar with is this engagement in Syria in February of 2018, where we saw the U.S. military almost come in direct confrontation with the Russian armed forces. We had a mysterious group of what we assumed were Russian personnel making their way towards the Kanoko oil fields, where we had strong allies, Kurdish allies that we were supporting, and subsequently tried to get on, quote-unquote hotline with our Russian counterparts, only to have the Russians deny that they were present or advancing. And subsequently, we engaged in artillery barrage, drone strikes. I can't remember what other aircraft were participating in it, but essentially what resulted in this kind of 4-hour battle between Wagner personnel and the U.S. Special Forces led to somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 600 dead Russian mercenaries. And so we've seen two front page events where this organization that was designed to be a plausibly deniable force kind of emerged from the shadows, both in direct confrontation with the U.S. armed forces, and then in Ukraine, direct confrontation with a U.S. ally. So to give you a little bit of overview of where my talk's going to go, I want to give a brief background on defining what private military companies are. Because I think one of the things that I'm guilty of as somebody who writes about this topic often, and what my counterparts are guilty of, is we kind of equate this organization as similar to what we think about when we think about Western private military corporations, and it's quite distinct. And I think having a frame of reference for how this organization is unique or was unique is important. I want to talk a little bit about the growing use of this type of actor by the Russian state. I think that, as I'll conclude with my talk, will we see clones either by Russia or by other actors? I think it's kind of a lingering question, but talk about the evolution of how this industry evolved in Moscow. Talk about some of the ongoing operations. If you've been following the news at all, it's no shock to anyone here that the head of this Wagner Group is no longer the head of the Wagner Group. Was assassinated not long after a mutiny. And we haven't seen the organization disappear entirely. We've just seen it be institutionalized by the Russian state. So I want to talk a little bit about how that's unfolded and what's changed since the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin. If you're not familiar with that name, you'll become intimately familiar throughout this talk. And then, again, the future of Russian PMCs, but also what the story of the rise and fall of the Wagner Group might mean for other actors looking to emulate or replicate what this organization was, and then also what it means for U.S. foreign policy and Western security more generally. So I have a few photos up here, just what we think about when we think about private contractors more generally, whether it's security guards in Afghanistan on the right, or your right, my left, security guards guarding Paul Bremer in Iraq. Those are from Blackwater. Most of you have probably heard about Blackwater before. Whether it's Chinese private security companies and in the bottom left here. Sorry, my direction was challenged here. But or whether it's the notorious South African private military company known as Executive Outcomes in the right. These are kind of what we think about, or at least what I think about when I think about private military and security companies. And I don't think that the Russian model really replicates most of this, right? A lot of these entities are truly private, independent in nature, where we think about how Russia's organized and coordinated these entities. It's been more quasi-independent, directly stood up by the state, oftentimes directly financed by the government, but kind of a way where we think about a kleptocratic regime allowing oligarchs to profit off of insecurity around the world. So most of you have probably heard the idea of, have we moved from a world of mercenaryism to a world of corporate warriors or private military companies? And I think having a little bit of a frame of reference of how they're distinct, you've probably heard the adage of the dogs of war, where it's individual soldiers just kind of finding the next insecure place to get a paycheck, versus what we've seen, the maturation of an industry where it's private military companies looking to go from bullets to the boardrooms. Is a little adage I have up here, talking about ways in which they can provide resources for either states that are struggling to develop a military or security infrastructure or security sector that is able to, quell external threats or even internal threats, or whether it's somebody looking for a state that's operating in another country looking to have security for whoever they're deploying there, right? So we're thinking about the way the industry's gone from an individual ad hoc to a more codified, formal kind of institutional structure. And Russia is watching all of this unfold, mostly throughout the end of the Cold War period. And we have obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union and the downsizing of the Soviet army, which leads to this just influx of personnel looking for opportunities, right? It's kind of a unique way in which Russia tries to court, or Russian entrepreneurs try to figure out ways to profit off of career experience. So this is one of the reasons why we see, not just in Russia, but around the world, the collapse of the Soviet Union had ripple effects for private security writ large, where we just saw exponential growth in the industry. And Russia wasn't on the outside, but it unfolded a little bit differently in the way in which these organizations evolved, matured, and developed. Where it would have looked more private in the early collapse of the Soviet period, we saw a more reconstitution and consolidation of private military and security firms by the Russian state writ large. Security for state infrastructure projects is really where this kind of started, very similar to the model that we see with the Chinese private security companies today. Russia is looking to ensure security of investment abroad, even investment domestically, and this is where the industry kind of finds its footing. Maritime security is another space where we see the Russians kind of evolve, mostly a byproduct of globalization, anti-piracy conditions. So we have this opportunity by the Russians to coordinate a market, if you will. Privateers looking to ensure continuity in their area of expertise. And then we have the idea, and this is where I think it gets really interesting, is the Russian state watching the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan unfold, where the U.S. had utilized private contractors to kind of maintain a larger footprint than we otherwise would have had we been relying exclusively on uniformed personnel. Russia sees this as kind of an opportunity, I'd argue, as an opportunity to say, how can we use this kind of new feature to our advantage? And most of you have heard the term, regular warfare, gray zone activities. This is where Russia's thrived, I think, in a lot of ways, and the way in which the evolution of this industry unfolded. They're looking to capitalize on what the West has essentially done. And lastly, I think the big part with an organization like the Wagner Group is, why are you pursuing a private corporation to do your bidding abroad? Right? And this gets into kind of the strategic logic of thinking about ways in which Russia might invest abroad with the idea of, I'll say here, of plausible deniability, right? Or at least the facade of it. Right, so you can put yourself in Putin's shoes and why you might make a foray into the Central African Republic, but do so through the veil of plausible deniability with a force that is not the Russian army, or why you might enter someplace like Mali through the veil of what is not the Russian army, but a private security contractor, right? If things go wrong, it's easy to deny. If things go okay, maybe you can invest. So I have this line up here from Lenin's dictum that if you meet steel, stop. If you meet mush, then push. So it's kind of this staging ground, this testing, this way in which you can use the bayonet to figure out if it's a permissive environment for you to enter. And at times, I think as the organization evolves, and as I'll get into in some of the cases I'll talk about, the organization, I think, quickly learned that it could also help set the conditions or lay the conditions for its demand. In other words, most of you have probably heard about Russian disinformation operations, right, trying to essentially suggest and undermine the rules-based international order, critique Western security partners, basically create a permissive environment where we'd see Russia now being able to capitalize and deploy this ready-made force. As I argue, and I think this is the challenge, if you've heard of the principal agent theory, right, where you develop an agent to go conduct chaos around the world. Sometimes the leash gets longer, it's harder to reel it in. And I think this is the story of the Wagner Group, right? As the leash continued to get longer and longer and the group gained more autonomy, power, resources, prominence, it saw itself in that kind of pecking order and that hierarchy of the Russian security architecture is indispensable and irreplaceable. And that ultimately became its downfall. Now, I say one other thing up here that I think is important to highlight is technically private military companies under Russian law, criminal code are illegal. A scholar much smarter than I am said this is a strategic move by the Russian state to outlaw private military companies as a form of illegality, as a form of control, right? You can empower those that you want. You can criminalize those that are less loyal, those that are out of line or have an accountability mechanism when they are caught abroad and come home. So this is, again, part of a broader strategic design for the organization, its evolution and its maturation. To give you kind of just a scale, and this is from the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who's done some great work on the evolution of the mercenary industry or the private military industry in Russia. This kind of gives you just kind of the exponential growth that's happened in the mid-2010s, where now we're seeing a number of different outfits. Scale kind of stops in 2021, but we've seen kind of I would say maybe a little bit of an uptick, but kind of a flatlining in that 25 to 30 private military and security companies, all of varying sizes, that have continued to serve the Russian government, mostly in Ukraine and mostly for the point of having a ready-made recruiting pipeline as they continue their quote-unquote special military operation. So we've seen growth in this industry, but Wagner really stands out as the outlier, the one that was most successful, the one that was most consequential, I think, in this rise of the private military industry. So you've probably seen a picture like this where there's insignia, where they're branding themselves, and this was kind of unique to the organization's marketability. It's still used today. In a lot of ways, it still has a cult following in Russia, and outside of Russia, it still has salience with some of the partner states that it worked with. But the organization's rise can be dated back to kind of the 2014 annexation of Crimea. I'll talk a little bit about the Little Green Men that most of you have probably heard about or familiar with and how it's unfolded. But it really is, genesis can be tied to this guy, Yevgeny Prigozhin, all right? A kind of remarkable figure in many ways, lifetime criminal, in jail throughout the latter part of the end of the Soviet Union's empire, gets out of jail, becomes very entrepreneurial. Most have probably heard him referred to as Putin's chef, right? He was a guy who started a hot dog stand, then rose to restaurateur, conglomerate, to then getting contract with the Ministry of Defense to provide their catering services, and just kind of had his hands in a bunch of different entrepreneurial outfits that led him into Putin's inner circle, right? I think that the photo, I don't think I have the photo up here, but catered a couple dinners where George W. Bush attended, right? And so there's a really infamous picture of him serving Putin and George W. Bush sitting right next to him. So I mean, he was running in his rise in this restaurant industry happened simultaneously with Putin's rise from mayor of St. Petersburg to president of Russia. How close he ultimately became to Putin is a debatable, disputed, but he did have, in some ways, close enough relations to win favor to support his mercenary rise. And then down here in this picture that's got a Sergei Shoigu's in the middle, but if you look closely, you can see the bald head there of Yevgeny Prigozhin. So you can see him engage with the military directly. And that's one of the things that makes this idea that Wagner, not really a private military company, directly grew out of the GRU, Russian military intelligence, right? To the point where they were co-located at a base in not far from Moscow, right? So we ultimately see very close links. But one of the important parts to think about when you start thinking about this concept that I've talked about of private military companies is, cast it to the side and think about Wagner as one cog in a broader network, right? Falling under a warlord type person like Prigozhin, who intentionally designed a convoluted network of entities, right, in which he could, skim from the state and profit abroad. So you had this group, Concord, that kind of did all the one-stop shop umbrella organization with a bunch of subsidiaries that operated around the world. From mining interests to troll farms. If you're familiar, he became really infamous for the Internet Research Agency, the IRA, that was implicated in election meddling in the United States in the 2016 election. And so we have this just networked approach that makes it very hard for the West, or those looking to counter the organization, to really challenge and cut it off, right? Whether it's a name change, whether it's a different individual in charge of one of these organizations, became really productive for things like sanctions evasion, right, and carving out its niche in terms of economic exploitation in the countries that Wagner ended up operating in. Down here in the middle is this guy, Dmitry Utkin. And I should reference him because he was a retired lieutenant colonel from the Russian Special Forces who his call sign was Wagner. He was a neo-Nazi. Hitler's favorite composer was Richard Wagner, and this is where his call sign came from. And his name became the name for the organization writ large. But he was one of the initial commanders of the organization. Most say would be the operational head, right? Where Prigozhin was the financier, Dmitry Utkin became kind of the guy that was closest to the recruits. Right, the one that could convince or convincingly commit to telling, hey, former GRU individual, this outfit's legitimate, right? There's a lot of economic opportunity and prosperity for you. Some of the other organizations that are up here, I'll reference briefly, are things like Evropolis, a Yevgeny Prigozhin oil extraction outfit that was integral to the clash in Syria. What ended up happening there was he negotiated a contract with Syria's Ministry of Energy that any territory reclaimed by the Wagner Group would lead to a 25% revenue sharing agreement with any extractive industry on that territory, right? So in other words, right, if you can take over some oil fields, whatever it produces, whatever we sell, you get a cut of it. Right, so this is kind of the way he designed this broader network of entities. And Wagner served as kind of the tip of the spear for the security element. It's a brief timeline to give you just an overview of what this organization's foray across the world looked like. All right, and this is just a sampling, depending on what think tank or research institute you want to look at. We've got upwards of 30 countries where Wagner personnel were testing the waters, but I focused predominantly on Russian activity in the African theater. So I've kind of highlighted here the Middle East and Africa, but it's some speculation that there were some Wagner personnel protecting Russian oil interests in Venezuela, for instance. The timeline kind of gives you this genesis of the organization being around from 2014 and the annexation of Crimea to 2022, 2023 timeframe. Right, it's a little disingenuous because my argument is the organization still exists. It just looks a little bit different now. It's kind of competing with a rival organization or still trying to save some of its or salvage some of the remnants of what it was in certain theaters. But we've seen it evolve from a place like Eastern Ukraine to Syria in the Middle East, to a place like Mozambique where it failed terribly, to a place like Mali where it's still functionally active, to a place like Ukraine and supporting Russia in a special military operation. One of the things that's important to note is all of these look a little bit different. Right, there's some similarities across some of the African deployments, but in general, we start thinking about the diversity of types of activities that Wagner offered, right? From a regime security, right, a coup-proofing, to frontline operations, right, offensive operations in a place like Syria, to supporting a government or a rebel offensive, rather, against the government and national court in Libya, right, hand in glove with the Russian state. So it kind of had a diverse portfolio of services that it offered depending upon the theater in which it was functioning. It just gives you a geographic scope of where it was. Again, I've selected here a little bit on Africa. But a few things to note, things have changed a little bit in Syria as of late. If you're not familiar with the collapse of Bashar al-Assad, and subsequently that's created a little bit of a logistics challenge for Russia's broader operations in Africa. We've seen them court General Khalifa Haftar in Libya, and you can see geographically why that becomes important. Syria used to be kind of an air bridge to connect Russia to the African AOR. When they lost that, it became how do we solve the logistical puzzle, right? So you've seen Russia try to court the new regime in Syria in ways that would ensure continuity of its operations, but it's really shored up its relationship with this rogue general in Libya to try to ensure that it continued to operate in Central and Sub-Saharan Africa. So I use this as kind of an illustration of the ambiguity, right, surrounding the rise of the organization. Something to think about when we talk about the Wagner Group is and I'm guilty of it too, is like this is where they started. But it's a disputed storyline of how it evolved in Crimea. Most suggest that Dmitry Utkin, the guy I referenced earlier, whose namesake is the Wagner's name, he was functionally operational here, right? Told to go to support efforts in the eastern Donbass, right? To assassinate those militia members who were supporting Russia but were seen as maybe a little bit or potentially a risk or disloyal. And subsequently, we see kind of the origin or genesis of what looks like a more functionally operational Wagner shell deployed via the guise of Utkin in Crimea. And this is really early stages, right? It isn't until Syria where we see the organization kind of come into its own, right? And I've already referenced a couple of the different activities it engaged in, right? But Syria became where most would say I think the thing is it's cut its teeth as a viable player in terms of a security provider, in terms of a security force assistance trainer, training some Syrian militias in support of al-Assad to fighting the Islamic State, right? So did all these different security and military this portfolio evolved here, which ultimately became useful for signaling to future clients, hey, here's the menu of security services we can provide. Their confrontation with the U.S. in 2018, I think, undermined their legitimacy in some ways. But as you'll see when they start entering some different theaters in Africa, what the demand signal was from these regimes is a little bit different than what someone like Bashar al-Assad was looking for. So, can't talk about Wagner in Africa without talking about AFRICOM and its posture statements when it starts looking at the threat Russia poses. And so what I highlight here is, the last two commanders of U.S. Africa Command have mentioned in their posture statements the relevance of Russia's disruptive aspirations and efforts to undermine the rules-based international order and undermine democracy and stability on the continent via Wagner, right? And I like two things to highlight. They don't follow any rules. They do what they want. They have a false offering of security. I think that's very much hits the nail on the head with what Wagner promised a lot of African regimes and what it actually delivered, right? I like to think of it as more as exploitation for security, resources, concessions for security. This is really the business model that Prigozhin set up. Some will suggest that there was some stability created by having Wagner there, right? Especially in places like the Central African Republic and Mali, where Islamic extremism in Mali or rebel offensives and based on ethnic tensions in the Central African Republic have just riddled the country with severe violence against civilians, unstable regimes. They've created some, I don't want to call it security, but they've campaigned successfully for the audiences that they're auditioning for. In other words, the regimes that hired them. So why they went to Africa in the first place, I think is an important question, right? Hey, look, Russia retreated from the continent at the collapse of the Soviet Union, so it made sense to figure out ways we could get involved again, right? You can win friends and allies. This can matter at international institutions like the UN, where we saw the African bloc voting behavior for the special military operation. They signed a bunch of different memorandums of understanding with with African states, mostly related to having outlets for weapons deployment. And I think the big one is, you're trying to court and develop and create insecurity for, I'd say disruption on the continent. It's kind of the antithesis of what China wants on the continent, which is stability and security, so it can continue its BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, infrastructure projects that benefit the Chinese state and maybe win some friends and allies. They do it and they prefer security, where the Russians, they sell the military relationship, but are very much how do we disrupt, create chaos, create insecurity, I think I've called it the mercenary industrial complex, how we keep our hooks in you. It's very like mafia boss-like. We want to sell security, give you a little bit of it, but court developed or create rather a manageable level of insecurity, so you have to keep us around. And that's really, I think, the model that they've perfected in a lot of these places. So in Libya, I highlight a few things here, right? What they really wanted was access to oil, just like in Syria. They thought they could export the same model that they pursued in Syria, albeit with some, nuances, but they ultimately worked hand in glove with the Russian state to try to overthrow the internationally recognized government of National Accord in Tripoli. They were not successful, but one of the things that they did in their retreat was engage in a number of different international humanitarian violations, from in particular laying mines and civilian torture. This is where they got the infamous, if you've ever heard of Wagner and the sledgehammer, this is where they executed individuals with the sledgehammer who were defecting. So they became, I would argue this is one of their really important points in their genesis, or their evolution rather, for their brutality, all right, and being agents of chaos. From there, they are operating in Sudan, where if you've tracked what's happened in Sudan, brutal civil war that's been ongoing for a few years now. They went in originally to support Omar al-Bashir, a dictator that had been in power for 30 plus years, to try to do protest repression. They just got hired a little bit too late, and then they've spent the better part of the last 3 years jockeying for influence, whether it's with the Sudanese armed forces or the rapid support forces, the two warring factions within Sudan. They've mostly landed in the camp of the RSF, but the whole point of their involvement there has really been to facilitate gold mining and smuggling from Sudan to the UAE, where it's been able to help Russia, I think, with sanctions evasion. So they became a conduit in which Russia could export this facade of security, in this case, not really any security, all right, but a means to have a conduit to exploit gold in this case. And then I think the Central African Republic is where Wagner entrenched itself most definitively. It's a place that I think most Western scholars or the US more generally find as a difficult theater and one that we're unclear on how to solve the security problems that persist. And Russia is just willing to show up, right? So Central African Republic had been under an arms embargo since 2013. In 2018, the Russian state formally petitioned the UN for a arms embargo lift, and were granted a concession. And in doing so, they shipped arms and trainers, but the trainers weren't Russian soldiers, they were Wagner personnel. And that was around 2018, and ever since, Wagner's just grown to, the numbers vary from 2,000 to 4,000 personnel carrying out counterinsurgency offensives, kind of embedded in the social fabric of the Central African Republic society, exploiting everything from the military element to engaging in the economic industries within the country to creating its own brewery. So you've seen them kind of become a central player for the regime, and basically what most have called a regime survival package, right? Without Wagner, would the regime still persist or not, right? And this, I think, is a really important juncture in the organization's development because it became the place in which it proved to other African regimes that it was a viable player for this exact thing, regime security. The other part that's interesting about its involvement here is it created subsidiary organizations. All right, in the photo up here on the top left, this is Sewa Security. It is a subsidiary of the Wagner Group. It's basically the personal security for Touadéra, the president of the country. Right, so it serves as kind of like the presidential security, and what this individual has done is use Wagner personnel to create this concentric circle where it's Wagner personnel directly around him, right, then the elite forces around them, and then the regular army around them, right? So he's tried to insulate himself with Wagner at the core, or Wagner personnel at the core for coup-proofing, right, to keep himself insulated from internal security threats. And then Mali is another interesting case, one I'm intimately familiar with, where we saw a decade-long counterterrorism mission led by the French kind of end in 2021, 2022 timeframe. So this counterterrorism mission had been across the Sahel region, all right, based in Mali, but supporting Niger, Burkina Faso, even into Chad a bit. And so we ultimately see a break with the French for a bunch of different reasons that are interesting to go into, but probably not directly related to this talk. And Wagner capitalized, right? The Russians capitalize on this anti-Western sentiment that becomes permissive across the country. And as Wagner enters, we see the groundwork laid for what we know today is, Russia's effort with the Africa Corps to expand its influence in places like Mali and Burkina Faso. When you start thinking about what they've done here, I think this is reflective of the type of activity that the organization engages in, right? And I think this transcends the Wagner Group to the maturation or effort to institutionalize it through the Africa Corps. Right, in March of 2022, basically after 3 months of being in country, supporting counterterrorism mission, we ended up seeing Wagner personnel engage in this brutal massacre in the town of Mora, all right, where we had several hundred individuals just summarily executed. Some at the hands of Wagner, some at the hands of the Malian armed forces, right, directed by Wagner, right? And I think their approach to counterterrorism is, shoot first, ask questions later, right? There's no due process of any meaningful outcome in their counterinsurgency policy. And that's one of the things that sells with a couple of the regimes here that are frustrated with the constraints imposed by Western counterterrorism and counterinsurgency partners, right? Russia was willing to, via this means, go in and, kill rather than try to reconcile the underlying causes of insecurity in the country that enabled extremism to thrive. And then the last kind of, hoorah for the organization was in Ukraine. And I'll be brief here. The prison recruitment, right, where we saw upwards of 50,000 prisoners kind of press ganged into the organization and then used as frontline shock troops in Bakhmut. All right, there's one way out of this prison. It's through God or it's through me, is like the way in which Prigozhin tried to campaign around the penal colonies in Russia. And we ultimately see the promise of pardons if you survive. And I flashed a number up before, right? We're talking about I think well over half the convict recruits were killed. And that might be a generous underestimation. But what ultimately transpired here, and this is one of the arguments I make in some of my writing, is when you've let that leash go too long, you then have to try to tighten it when an organization gets out of line. Russia never intended to have this war in Ukraine last, shocking to this audience, last as long as it has, right? There's a strategic miscalculation, a lot of intelligence failures, right? Underestimating the will of the Ukrainian armed forces. And subsequently, we're forced to rely on a group like the Wagner Group to come back and backfill positions that they lost, right? And kind of serve as a stopgap while they reconstituted and refigured out and reorganized their operation. That told Prigozhin that I'm really important. And throughout the war, if you were tracking the 2022, 2023 timeframe, you see Prigozhin get increasingly hostile to the Ministry of Defense, right? Starts calling for more resourcing. He starts directly challenging Putin through cryptic messaging, suggesting that we're not getting what we need, but we're the only successful force, right? We're the only ones who are actually reclaiming any territory and making it in advances. And that leads to this mutiny in June of 2023. Where they made it to 125 miles of Moscow, and I flashed this guy up, Yunus Yevkarov, the guy that's on his phone here in the bottom. He'll reemerge in a second as an important figure, but he was at Rostov-on-Don in southern military district of Russia, basically where they were running the special military operation. And Putin basically takes him captive, right? And this becomes really symbolic in a lot of ways of the power that Wagner had, right? The military wasn't firing on him. And meanwhile, Wagner personnel are shooting down, like their convoy is shooting down Russian helicopters, right? So you can go find the footage online, but it gets pretty precarious. And most are looking at this as, this is the first legitimate challenge we've seen by an actor to try to, push their way to Moscow and maybe even jeopardize Putin's regime, right? But then 2 months to the day after the mutiny, right, and I've got William Burns, former director of the CIA, up here saying, right, Putin's the ultimate apostle of payback. You have Prigozhin dying in a plane crash or an assassination, right? So what's that mean? Well, does the organization die? And the short story is no. Right after the mutiny, we see a concerted effort by the Russian state to try to figure out how to consolidate and institutionalize the Wagner Group. I think this is really important as we start thinking about the challenge of allowing a criminal enterprise to thrive and then trying to figure out how you get all its pieces and parts back under government control, right? If anyone can figure it out, it's a regime that thrives in kind of corruption and kleptocracy, right? But it became difficult, and this is why most would suggest Prigozhin survived as long as he did, was this is a play by the Putin regime to try to figure out all the inner workings of Wagner's operations from places like the Central African Republic to Mali. So Yunus Yevkarov is there in the middle. He's now the head of what is now termed the Africa Corps. And the operational commander is this guy, Andrei Averonov, who basically was in charge of sabotage operations for the Russian state, GRU officer, who's kind of dictating what's happening in Africa. After the death of Prigozhin, the Russian state came out and said, we've got a ton of ambition. We're going to have 40,000 recruits. We're going to staff this Africa Corps outfit. It's going to backfill all the Wagner operations. African partners, we're committed to you. And it's been woefully inadequate, I think maybe is the right term, where they downsized the number or the expectation for recruits to 20,000. But nonetheless, we have seen some effort by the organization to grow, all right? But I say grow in the sense of open new operations, but not really staff them well. In the Sahel region specifically, In January of 2024, we saw a contingent of 100 to 200 Africa Corps personnel deployed to Burkina Faso to engage in security force training was the adage. I think it's to protect the Ibrahim Traore regime, coup regime, a military junta that's in power. And then in Niger, after its coup in July 2023, we sent a delegation in early 2024 to try to discourage partnerships with the Russians. That didn't work. We were unceremoniously asked to leave. Our status of forces agreement was broke, and the Africa Corps backfilled. And I say backfilled generously, right? I think, again, another contingent of 100 to 200 personnel deployed there to basically serve as coup-proofing. Or at least that's the way I interpret or make that argument. They've also now gone to Equatorial Guinea, where we're looking to maybe have a unconstitutional regime transition. The president there is getting up there in age, and his son's the expected heir to his throne, if you will. So subsequently, we've seen Russia try to use the Africa Corps as a security package for autocrats that are looking to shore up their security, but not really expand the security outside of their capitals. What have we done? And I'll be brief here. A lot of talk, some action with the E instrument of national power via sanctions. Nothing kinetic, at least as far as I'll have access to, in a meaningful way. And then some designations where we've designated the Wagner Group in 2023 a transnational criminal organization to try to deter relations with it. It's become more, I would argue, more complicated now that the Wagner project falls directly under control of the Russian state, right? It's created a complication in ways of what we can and are willing to do to directly engage with that organization. I'll briefly mention the idea of replication, because it's one of the things I thought a lot about. Is this was quite successful for not a lot of money. And I should note that Putin came out and claimed that he funded the Wagner Group to the tune of $1 billion throughout the entire war in Ukraine, right? So that facade of plausible deniability that everyone said was a facade, right? The thin veil was gone completely with Putin claiming that. Now we have Africa Corps, which directly is under the Russian state control. Other states looking to replicate or emulate are going to learn, I think, valuable lessons from the Wagner experiment. Yes, it's a useful foreign policy tool. It can be cheap, right? It can be effective in achieving disruption, right? But as the mutiny suggests, it can be consequential, right? If there's too much agency drift, if they get out of line, right? And it becomes really important to have and maintain oversight. I think states like Turkey have utilized an organization known as Sadat, a private military company with direct ties to Erdogan, to kind of engage in some activities across the African theater. China, as I mentioned before, has their private security contractors that are looking to shore up Chinese infrastructure security or Chinese projects, infrastructure across its BRI initiative. And then we have folks like the UAE who have small forces in the first place and have historically relied on outsourcing security, right? So I don't know that they're looking to emulate, but I think that the idea of learning lessons and applying best practices is the way that I would suspect the future will unfold. I don't think Russia's interested in abandoning the model, right? I think it's learned a valuable lesson in many ways. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for them to attempt to reconstitute the veil of plausible deniability with some future iteration of the Wagner Group, should the Africa Corps experiment peter out. So my key takeaways, and I think it's worth noting, is Wagner's not merely a rogue mercenary force. Adaptability based on theater was one of its key traits, and I'm happy to engage in some Q&A on how it differed across its different operations. The one thing is, we're not looking at strong, consolidated, thriving democracies that are demanding these types of services, right? We're looking at weak states with weak institutions, with insecurity, who are either ineligible for Western security assistance or unwilling to cooperate with the guardrails that Western security assistance comes with, right? And in that kind of environment, we're seeing Russia and maybe even China looking ahead have a comparative advantage. What that means for Western security assistance writ large is I think the problem sets don't actually dissipate partnering with Russia. They get worse. And at some point, it necessitates picking up the pieces if we want to retain our position or retain this international rules-based order. And so I'll kind of pose a general question for you're in this kind of predicament. You're in a vulnerable state. Europe's gone. The U.S. is hesitant to enter. Russia comes in with guns, propaganda, support. No questions asked. What do? Right? And this is the value proposition that I think the West hasn't figured out how to address entirely, and I think Russia is willing and able to engage in. As I suggested, right, with 100 or 200 personnel, you can displace a decade-long counterterrorism mission or force an actor to break with the United States. And so I'll just sum this up, right? For us, the question isn't just how to stop Wagner, or a group like it. It's how to offer something before the next regime signs onto the dotted line, right? I think they're parasitic. I think they thrive on a relationship of dependency. And as I suggested before, insecurity is really their MO, right? The false promise of security, but in reality, insecurity that can lead to the quiet death of sovereignty for these countries. So that's my presentation. Thanks for your attention, and happy to take questions now. So.
Hey, evening, sir. Commander Mike Groh, senior class student. You mentioned that the activities of the Wagner Group in Africa was counterproductive to China's BRI initiatives. My question would be, with the reconsolidation and retasking of the organization under Russia more formally, do you see a scenario where, with the no-limit partnership between China and Russia, where they could work in tandem with one another, where China provides economic infrastructure support and Russia providing security support? Thanks.
Yeah. Their no-limits friendship, I assume, is what you're kind of alluding to there. I think now that the organization has been folded under the Africa Corps branch, maybe there's an opportunity for, reeling in the types of violence that the Wagner Group was, infamous for, should China request such. I'm trying to think of the theaters in which they might actually come into conflict, and the one that kind of jumps to mind most directly is going to be a place like Central African Republic, where if for those in the audience who are following, I think there were several Chinese miners that were killed. And some attributed it to the fact that, I think Wagner's created an environment of insecurity. It was already quite insecure before. But its brutality, right, is leading to, foreign interveners becoming victims to brutality from all sides. So I think that there might be some more opportunity now that it's a state project, a formal state project, for cooperation, but that'd just be my speculative answer to ways in which it might unfold. I think before, when you've granted a lot of autonomy, and I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek because as I suggested, it really depended on where Wagner was operating. In Libya, I don't think they had a very long leash because you're working right alongside the Russian military proper. Right? In Mali, it was a little more blended, but a little more autonomy over time. In the Central African Republic, I think you're kind of freewheeling is the Wagner personnel are the Russians proper, all right, outside of their diplomatic efforts, right? So they're really the military. So that's going to be kind of your question's a good one. I think that there's just opportunity for more cooperation to create that. But I think it undermines the model writ large for what they're long-term selling. And the reason I say that, for those in the audience, China has a different value proposition, which is, I would argue, predatory in many ways in Africa, but it's economic investment, right, that necessitates security, right? And Russia promises economic investment, but never actually follows through, right? It kind of will suggest that it's signing an economic agreement. Hey, we're going to invest in nuclear power, or we're going to invest in oil infrastructure. We're going to invest in mining infrastructure development in Mali, and most of it's just lip service. And in reality, their only real offering are these security forces. So hopefully that's my long-winded answer to your question. Not everyone at once. Yep, Colby.
Colby Broadwater from the senior class. Is there any validity to the view, and you argue, I think, against it, that that Wagner could be responsible for the stop of the coup contagion? Because you had 2 in BFA, 2 in Mali, 1 in Niger, and we've been about 18 months without a coup in the Sahel. So is the coup proofing that they're doing in CAR, is that catching on, or is it something else that you look as that factor?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the idea is the coup-proofing value proposition that Wagner sold actually effective because we haven't seen a coup? I would make the social science argument of correlation doesn't equal causation is my first assessment of it. I do think that it creates serious coordination challenges for the military, right? I think that in Central African Republic, for instance, I don't think the perception of Wagner being helpful is shared across the entire armed forces, right? There are segments that are frustrated, that feel marginalized or out of the, inner circle of power and authority. So I don't think it's homogenous, but I think that there is serious risk in trying to veto Wagner's presence or challenge the regime. So in that sense, it's created what I'll call a coordination challenge for the armed forces, right? And I think that most academic scholarship that's investigated this is when you bring in outsiders, right, it can actually serve an effective coup-proofing function because it is a deterrent. And I think the differentiation between, the presence of French forces and U.S. forces versus the presence of Russian mercenaries is one is going to thrive in violence and be willing to deploy it even against the armed forces. Where I think that that gets into if that makes sense, that gets into a stickier situation. So I'm hesitant to say they've been successful in it for other reasons, and they've served maybe a deterrent effect. But I think there's a bunch of other reasons why coups happen. And I don't think the underlying conditions that led to a lot of the civ mil unrest have actually been remedied because they're present. So by most forecasting models would suggest that places like Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali are the most at risk for a coup. So it's not a matter of if, just when. And I think that's one of the other value propositions that the Russians are offering is, the moment we're gone, if we're even going to let us leave, is the moment that you do threaten that kind of, you lose that deterrent effect. So it's kind of a circular way of saying maybe. I think I saw another hand. I don't know if the question went away. Yep.
Good afternoon, sir. Renee Bayer, Defense Intelligence Agency. I just wanted to piggyback on the gentleman's question earlier about the relationship between China and Russia in Africa, and as we see the Wagner Group being institutionalized more by Russia's government. Given our current administration and our direction of the State Department and things that we are doing to influence diplomatic relations with our African partners, as well as our coalition partners writ large around the world, what should we be focusing on to answer the China relationship with Russia from an economic perspective, but also looking at other instruments of national power to bolster the sovereignty of those African nations?
Yeah, it's a tough question. It's like solving all of the problems at once. I think so. If you're not tracking, right, it's kind of in flux right now of what State Department reorganization would look like. There's a rumor mill that AFRICOM may be downgraded to a subcommand under EUCOM. That's all kind of hearsay and speculation as of right now, but I think Secretary of State Rubio came out today and talked about a little bit of the reorganization efforts. And all that's to suggest that I think some of our efforts to combat disinformation that we've traditionally had, the Global Engagement Center, all right, some of the, the global agency or the global media arm, I'm drawing a blank on, right, those are no longer in existence. So it's created, I say, a gap in terms of what we have in terms of the information and messaging front, right, to counter that relationship through, the I, instrument of national power. On the diplomatic front, I'm working on some ideas where it's, one of the speculations is that we're going to have a special envoy for African affairs that will work in bilateral terms with African states to incentivize relationships with the U.S. Right? It's an ambitious project, but what that means is, and what I think, engaging with regional economic communities is one way, right? You'll probably hear this cliche, African solutions to African problems, talked a lot, or thrown out a lot across different administrations. That's the idea of, enabling African states to identify potential solutions to the problem sets that they're dealing with. And from my perspective, a lot of that can be done through bolstering and supporting regional economic communities, at least as a starting point. Some of those ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, looks a lot different today than it did 2 years ago. So I say that tongue in cheek, but I think that's a potential opportunity for the United States to pursue. Militarily, the critiques have often been the areas that we focus on are not always the right problem sets. Our counterterrorism training isn't the type of counterterrorism training that is directly relevant to the serious counterterrorism or terrorism problems that are plaguing places in the Sahel. And then in addition to that, we've relied on our European partners. We were kind of a supporting element. Not exclusively, but that was our predominant role. And I think that security force assistance writ large is challenging and maybe more complicated today than it was, 5 years ago. So I don't have a perfect answer for what we're able to do. I think prioritization, or not forgetting that, I say that this way, the problems facing the U.S. government writ large, right, and DOD directly are, Indo-PACOM and the pacing threat that is the PRC. I think we can do more than one thing, right? The idea we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So I think my broad thing is don't discount the relevancy of the problem sets that are facing the African theater, which are, the drivers of extremism, lack of education, opportunities, and vast inequality, governance challenges and corruption. And to the degree that we can support institutions that counter those, I think it's better for everyone, but it's a cheap answer. That's what I got.
Thank you, Dr. Faulkner, for your insights on the Wagner Group and the PMCs. That's a great presentation. And that's it for tonight. Unfortunately, we'll see you again on 29 April for our next lecture about warfighters and strategic empathy. Thank you for attending.
Thanks.